Ladies and gentlemen, welcome with me, Christian Keitel from the University of Stirling, soon for family reunification, as I just heard, at the University of Dundee. Congratulations for that.
Thank you.
That's nice. You don't have to commute then.
Yeah.
Not commuting is good.
Yeah, it is, but it also kind of like kills the example that I'm using on the next slide. So I have to come up with something new, but I can still use it today.
Okay,
so
sometimes we eat the bear, sometimes the bear eats you.
Yes.
So Christian Keitel, so happy that you guys studied psychology at the University of Leipzig and did his PhD here. Of course, you know, all good people do that. I did mine for some more. Spending some postdoc time here as well. Okay, right.
Not very mobile, right?
Yes. But what does Bonnie mean?
Bonnie?
Yes.
Nice.
Nice.
Yeah.
Because he lives in Bonnie, Scotland since 2014 with his family, obviously. Worked at Glasgow, worked at Stirling as a lecturer, and now at Dundee again. I'm happy to have you here, and we're looking forward to your presentation on physiological influence on brain state changes and their consequences for subjective perception.
Thank you. Yeah,
welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It is a long title. It's a bit of a kind of like, I'm still working on it, right? And maybe I can start the talk with a few disclaimers. The first one is that thanks for the invitation, and I'm really happy that you draw a really wide circle around the language thing in your language circles lectures, which allows me to be here today and talk about the things I have on my slides, because language is not going to be a topic that I'm going to talk about, but hopefully you will see that there are immediate connections that you can actually draw from what I'm going to tell you. The other thing is that what I'm presenting to you today is not super new, or some of the stuff is, but it's kind of like the consequence of a little bit of a soft reset that I have done over the past couple of years in terms of, changing the direction of the research a little bit. Because when I was doing my PhD here and my postdoc and so on, I was into this thing called frequency tagging that you might have heard about. And Anna has alluded on a topic in her talk where there is also a little bit of a controversy. What are we looking at here? Frequency tagging has been reinvented as entrainment, also in the visual domain. And I got a little bit frustrated with it. And I was looking for something new. So what you see on the following slides is kind of like a different direction that I have taken, and that doesn't really involve tracking too much, or entrainment, or whatever you want to call it. Although I think on my very last slide, there is a nice example for entrainment. But let's dive into it. And this is the example that I was talking about earlier. So most of the research that I'm going to tell you about today comes from, so this is my everyday slide, right? So if you listen to a talk, you have the slide in the beginning where somebody explains in very lay terms, this is why I'm interested in this topic. And then on the next slide, we dive into the topic, and we're not talking about anything every day anymore. So this is the everyday slide. This is my commute, the one that Lars just mentioned. We live in Dundee up there. This is the University of Stirling, and by car it takes about 1 hour. There's also a really nice train connection that you can take, so it doesn't need to be the car, just to alleviate any concerns. But the car journey is actually something that is very close to an example that I need to make here, and that is the interesting observation that if you do this journey often enough, you find yourself like a little bit maybe bored with the landscape, although it's really a nice ride. I don't know, has any one of you ever been to Dundee or to Perth or to Stirling? No one, really?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, yes,
Fantastic.
I studied in Glasgow.
Yeah, how do you like it?
I love it. Overall Scotland, every bit of it.
Yeah, I totally agree. Anna agrees too. So it's really nice. So it's not like driving from Leipzig to, let's say, Chemnitz, for example, where everything is relatively flat. Here you have some nice hills in the background, and in winter there's a little bit of snow-covered tops, so it is actually quite nice looking. But after a while, you know it all, right? And then you find yourself in a position where you are in your car, and you drive this road back to work and back from work, And suddenly you find yourself in a situation where you think about something entirely different, right? So in psychological terms, we can say that you have switched from sort of like an external focus on the task at hand, the driving, which you should be focusing on, to something more internal. Your shopping list, the lecture that you have to give the next day, and so on. This is one of the things that I'm really interested in. So what makes this switch? How does that happen? How fast does it go? Which internal physiological processes lead us to make these switches? How often do they occur when we are performing in a monotonous task? And is there an increasing frequency over time, and so on? And we can even put this into a little bit more schematic and theoretical terms on the next slide. And these are the two processes. So if you feel like you are in this like post-lunch sort of dip in terms of your concentration, which also kind of relates to what I'm talking about, then on this slide, you already have the main message of this talk. What I'm interested in is looking into processes that we don't usually look into in our experiments, stuff that happens over the course of hours. And the two things that I've been looking into over the past years is trends over time, something either increasing or decreasing over the course of maybe our typical experiment or task performance. And the other one is fluctuations, if you wish, over time, right? So you have something fluctuating not on the temporal scale of our usual experiments, on the scale of seconds, but over the course of several hours. And the two parts of my talk, they kind of like evolve around these two situations. There might be more of these situations that I haven't thought about. Happy to discuss this, but I think these are the two main, fluctuations, trends, variabilities that we should be looking into, but haven't really so far. So they don't usually play a role in the experiments that we do. Okay. Let's dive deeper into this idea of we're looking into what happens over the course of an experiment. I think you're all familiar with this sort of like paradigm, which has dominated oscillatory neuroscience for quite a while now. It doesn't even need to be oscillatory neuroscience, that's just where I'm coming from. But usually what we have in our experiment is something happens on the screen or via auditory presentation or any other modality really. And that evokes some kind of stimulus-related activity, right? That can be an ERP or some change in oscillatory activity in the brain. And what people really got interested in over the course of the last, let's say, 20 years and have done numerous experiments on is this bit here that leads up to the stimulus, the spontaneous activity. And they have done these experiments to characterize how the spontaneous activity then has an impact on what happens to the stimulus afterwards, right? So in a way, all these experiments went in the direction that there was some kind of like assumption about the spontaneous activity, and then usually what kind of psychometric outcome you have. Maybe there can be something like hits and misses in an experiment. So does our pre-stimulus activity somehow predict whether a participant detects or misses a particular stimulus, and so on. And the interesting thing here is there was always this implicit assumption, and I really like finding these implicit assumptions in the literature. So if you think about science, what are the things that we actually always assume, but we have never really tested? Then if you look at this, this is, I think, how people tend to think about how this pre-stimulus spontaneous activity impinges on the behavioral outcome or any other outcome. That is, you have your experiment, and whatever your brain state is, the spontaneous activity leading up to the stimulus, this fluctuates randomly, rather randomly over time, around some hypothetical mean value, right? So if you look into these trials of the experiment, from trial to trial, you have these jumps, these random jumps, right? And this is kind of like the starting point for the first part of the talk. What can we actually say about this assumption? Can we take a closer look at this? Does it actually apply in the typical situations that we have in our experiments? And I brought one example where we have done that. It's a bit of an older example, but I think it nicely highlights that there are consequences for behavior, and there are consequences when you look into brain activity. I quickly have to reintroduce hemi-neglect. I think you're all familiar with that. People with brain lesions tend to neglect one part of their visual hemifield. One interesting thing, if you ask them to bisect a line at the central location, they will usually make a great error in judging where the actual veridical center of that line is, like in this example here, right? What I didn't know before I started this research, this was actually led by Chris Banwell, who was then a postdoc in Glasgow and again now is a colleague at the University of Dundee, was that we were looking into these line bisections in healthy subjects. And I learned that even people without lesions in their brains, at least not lesions that we know of, we all have something like a very small pseudo-neglect. So the normal brain kind of like makes consistent errors in judging the line center. So when I ask you all to judge where the line center is, you will likely all make a slight error to the left, I think. I don't remember the details, but it's in the paper if you're interested. And this is what people did in the experiment for 1 to 2 hours, I think, right? So they were asked with this stimulus, for which it is rather easy to say, okay, so we are at the center, but also stimuli. No, it's actually quite complicated for this one, but we had easier ones that were clearly left or right lateralized. So it was much easier to say it was left and right. And here are the behavioral results. So for the actual, on the x-axis, you can see where the actual midpoint was, what we call the transector. And you get these psychometric curves. So this is what I told you before. If the veridical location of this transector was far removed from the actual center, then participants were really strongly of the opinion that one side was shorter and exactly the same on the other end. And at the center, there was this big sort of like 50-50 situation going on that you would expect. The interesting bit is, and I've already split this up here for you, but usually you see that if you start this experiment, there is a slight shift towards the left, actually, right? So participants make the pseudo-neglect error that I've already talked about. And to cut the long story short here, in this experiment, it showed that over the course of the experiment, if you compare the first 3 blocks with the second 3 blocks and the last 3 blocks, there was a shift, a very slight shift in the pseudo-neglect error that people made. Actually, in this case, it was that they moved closer to the veridical location in their judgments of the line centers, okay? So the point that I want to drive home here is that over the course of the experiment, the pseudo-neglect changed, okay? So this is the perceptual outcome of time on task, of the time that participants have spent in this experiment. Now, what Chris also did in this experiment is he recorded EEG. And we also wanted to look into this pre-stimulus oscillatory activity that I've talked about earlier and check whether the pre-stimulus oscillatory activity gave any indication of which error people would make. And if you look into this cluster here of, let's say, broadly alpha activity, and then divide trials just for the sake of, analysis into trials that have relatively high power for each participant versus trials who have relatively low power, you also see a slight difference in this kind of like judgment that people make about the line center, okay? So we concluded that the pre-stimulus alpha power also has an influence on subjective line center judgment. This is our neurometric. If we want to summarize the data that we have seen so far, then what we actually found is that this is the first bit that I showed you from the behavioral data, that the time on task had an impact on the perceptual judgments that people made over time. And we also know that the pre-stimulus alpha power influences these subjective line center judgments. And now if you look at these two things together, we got this idea that we need to look into how these two things are actually related to each other or linked with each other. And in fact, in an analysis that I'm going to save you just now, we found that there is a mediation going on, right, between time on task and alpha power and the subjective line center judgments. I'm always struggling to explain this better. This is why I have this graph back on here for you that I think makes the case much better. This is the thing that I showed you in the beginning, where this is sort of like the status quo, the implicit assumption that you have these random fluctuations over time. If you look into the data that we got on this experiment, and you now define the psychometric outcome here as the line-centered judgment, then a completely different case that you could make is that you actually see something like this in the data, right? Oops, shouldn't be there just yet. So that over time, you see this deterministic decrease that would totally account for the difference in psychometric outcome. So over time on task, you have this subjective line-centered judgment, and people start judging this completely differently. But what the mediation actually tells us in the end is that we do capture a little bit of additional variance in this task by saying, okay, so there is a time on task trend, but there is still spontaneous fluctuation in the data as well that can be explained maybe by spontaneous fluctuation in alpha power pre-stimulus. Okay, so we went a bit further because we were interested in actually looking at alpha and seeing what it does over time. Just one more slide on that. And what we found here is, first of all, if you look at all the participants, and this is an even bigger sample, not just the line-centered judgment, but I think about between 30 to 40 participants across different experiments, you can actually make some nice sort of like, you can interpret this in a way that you say, that if you look into our experiment and say that the experiment had a length of 1 to 2 hours, then you can make statements like the power increases by 1 dB over the course of 1 hour in this particular task. And because we had the spectra already, we also looked into what happens in terms of the frequency of alpha. And here again, we saw an actual decrease of 0.2 Hertz over the course of an hour. So we're not saying it is a linear trend, but over the course of this experiment, this is how you can characterize the changes in ongoing oscillatory activity. Okay, so two interesting things that we're still working on looking into further. Just to summarize what I've just shown you. Oh yeah, and I should have mentioned this bit. I have some extra slides on that if you're interested, but I'm going to save those for later. That these two trends were partially independent, which kind of like goes in the direction that we've discussed earlier, that, or that's at least our interpretation, that you have different alpha rhythms going on at the same time in the brain. And what we're seeing here is maybe a consequence or a shadow of the activity of different alpha generators or rhythms going on at the same time, and these showing partially independent trends. Good. So to summarize this part, this first part, what we know now is that we should always be considering time on task as a source of variability. And maybe that's also something that could be interesting if you have language paradigms, maybe sentence comprehension, where you want to model what is different at the beginning of the experiment versus the end of the experiment, potentially. I don't know. I haven't seen anything on that just yet. And on a more neurophysiological level, we have started to actually describe the differences in oscillatory activity. There's some literature on power differences already, also a little bit on frequency changes over time. And the interesting thing here that I've already talked about is that these seem to be occurring independently of each other, at least partially. And to go back a little bit to my initial example. So I've told you about this driving along this road. And now the question is, I've told you about line bisection. How do these two things relate? So I think it would be interesting to know if there are actual changes to our perception that are maybe a little bit more drastic than this, small change in line bisection in pseudo-neglect. If you are performing in a task for a considerable amount of time. So if you have to really sustain attention on something for 2 hours, 3 hours, and especially if you're in a situation where you have responsibility, not just for your own life, but for others, air traffic controllers, pilots, bus drivers, and so on, train drivers, then maybe that's something that we want to know about. So one way this is going to go is just to check whether we can find more drastic examples of changes in subjective perception over time, potentially tied to neurophysiological mechanisms as well. That's my first part. Maybe I should drink some of this nice Sachsenobst apple juice and yeah.
Flaschenöffner, I wanted to ask.
Don't need one, thank you. Maybe this is also a good point to answer some questions if there are any just now.
I have two, but I can also ask them afterwards.
Oh, there was somebody behind you.
Oh yeah,
it's okay.
Yeah, no, super interesting to me. So thank you for the first part of the talk. I was wondering, you mentioned alpha power and alpha frequency. There are statistics that you've looked at over the course of the experiment.
Yeah.
And I've seen you took a very long window prior to the stimulus, and you saw this alpha cluster quite spread quite some seconds before the stimulus. And I was wondering if these parts of these spontaneous trends that you see instead, if you've ever looked at something like the phase of the oscillation that you can see for the single trial by trial perception.
It's actually a super interesting question. So first of all, I think I kind of like put different stuff on the slides. So what you looked at here on this slide, this bit is from a different analysis than what I showed earlier. I think this is 1 second of pre-stimulus activity across different experiments that looked into pre-stimulus activity. And I think you mentioned this one too here, right? So where we looked into this, not really defining the time, but just looking where's the effect. Yeah. And here, just to get to your second question, we have done this a couple of times, and it's a super interesting, you know, a big question in the field anyway. What does phase do? And we never find anything in phase. So this analysis in this paper also looked into phase effects on perception. There wasn't an effect on line center judgment in any way. And Chris has done a couple of other studies, also looking into alpha effects on perception and even on confidence, really. So a little bit of metacognition. And phase never pops up as something that actually explains variability in the data. Yeah, I can go on for the on this topic for quite a bit, but maybe we can discuss this later. Yeah.
Maybe also related to the first part. So I wonder, why would you assume brain states to fluctuate randomly, like white noise in the first place? I mean, it's well known that brain states, like one brain state all depends on previous brain states, and so on. So it's kind of an autocorrelation anyways, and maybe that's what you observe with those slow trends over time.
Fully agree. So this is exactly the implicit assumption that we wanted to tackle with that, right? So why would they change randomly over time? Okay. Yeah.
So let's talk about this alpha power period of time. That sounds an awful lot like a fatigue effect. You're claiming that you're basically measuring fatigue with your alpha power.
Yeah, terminology is, so I've been looking into that further. Fatigue is one thing that always pops up. Then what else is there? Yeah, the opposite is vigilance, and people are also talking about mind wandering. So I think what we're looking at with this long-term trend, this is probably highly fatigue related. You're probably right there. So we're just measuring how tired people get by performing the task over time. Could still be something else though. So I'm also a little bit hesitant to put these labels to it, because for now we're just interested in the neurophysiological processes, and fatigue is also a little bit hard to define. What does it really mean? So what kind of predictions can you make from using that label? Yeah. Okay, there was some. Yeah.
Did you also look at higher frequencies? See that alpha increases and higher frequencies decrease, and happen a bit as well?
So did we look in? I remember that we did some control analysis to check for exactly that, whether we're looking at a shift in the slope of the power spectrum. That's going to become interesting for the second part of the talk, where we rigorously control for it. Here, I don't really remember the outcome, but I think It was just the actual change in the algorithm and not a tilt in the power spectrum. Yeah.
Maybe more general question. Usually in our experiments, we have a lot of trials, and so there is like temporal stability somehow. Maybe ITIs also don't really vary that much. And so, of course, we introduced this example of like always driving along the same road, but even there we have like more variety in like perceptual inputs than we have in our experiments. And do you think it's like, it's really like this factor of temporal stability we have in like also predicting next like exoceptive input somehow? Yeah, it's like a very limits us a lot to like the generalization we actually want to see somehow. I mean, because these trends you look at, I mean, they don't really generalize to a lot of situations we usually like face.
Yeah. So
maybe very repetitive work people do, but this is maybe also becoming less and less frequent over time.
I agree. So it's difficult for me to extract the question from it, but I completely agree with what you just said.
Just your opinion on it, because it's so common and it's what we do most of the times.
Yeah, I think so. If I'm filtering something out there, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but this is actually one of the things we're interested in is whether we can find ways to help people escape from these episodes of that you rather do not want them to be in when they are driving, right? And maybe in experiments, this is one way that you do it, that you introduce something new, right? And it's true that in real world
more like flexibility somehow and demanding more flexibility. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Oh, okay. Makes sense. Yeah.
Just a small question about relatedness. So you say that alpha power increases during the course of experiment, and perceptual judgments also change.
Yeah.
But why did you make the conclusion that they are related?
So the first thing that we were really afraid of is that we see both changes over time just because of the passage of time, right? So you could see a correlation if alpha goes up over time and the line center judgment changes over time, that they correlate just because time passes, right? And that's why we did this complicated mediation analysis that I always have difficulties explaining, where we found that both of these are sources of variability, which kind of like took away the argument that it's just the passage of time that explains everything. So there's extra variability explained by taking both of these things into consideration. And is that what you're looking for as a response to the question? So I think I missed the target a little bit there, but yeah.
That was
Okay.
One question.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks for the interesting approach. My question, maybe you covered it in the last answer, is whether you factored in the time of day. Because what we observe, for example, are, or what everybody knows is the kind of systematic fluctuations in the hormonal cycles, for example, over the course of the day. Or we also observed, for example, changes in MRI measures of repeated MRI measures or measurements within the same participant. So
super important variable that we didn't think about back in the day, but that is now a standard procedure in the experiments, that we make sure that we record the time of day and also a relative measure of how many hours slept and how many hours awake before the experiment, just to make sure that we capture all of these things, because people have different rhythms, right? So you can have somebody come in the afternoon for an experiment, but they only got up an hour before the experiment. Has happened before. So that's true.
Totally.
Thanks for pointing that out.
One suggestion, and maybe I misunderstood this analysis, and relates to a question that came up. You're speaking about time on task, and you want to be sure that it's really that the alpha change is really related to time on task. So would your baseline be something like time on task? You just draw a trajectory for all the intervals between the tasks, like the fixation process or something like that, and see whether you get the same slope. And if not, you can be sure that relates really to the task.
So we haven't done this in this experiment, but there is some other work that shows that if you only look at the blocks of the experiment, you see that in each single block, and there's a short rebound in the break period. Yeah.
That's my kind of my next question. So, like, I mean, how low can I go? You know, if I drive a car to 10. Of course, you know, but at some point you have to recover. Otherwise, you like, if you stay in cabinets.
I'm not going to comment on cabinets. Yes, agreed.
Yeah, I mean, studying.
It's clear that this is not. This is just, you know, what I showed you here. So there must be an asymptote somewhere, right? There's no possibility that you can go into a negative alpha frequency range or something like that. So it would be interesting to look into more long range effects.
Like that moment where you decide to like turn around or get up and leave, you know, something because you think that this is it.
Yeah.
I'm like out of my.
I'm gonna go back to Leipzig.
Yeah.
Okay.
And like another question that I had was about asymmetry, because the spectrum that you show is like CZ or grand average or something like that.
Which spectrum you're talking about?
The TFR.
The TFR.
Yeah.
I think this is an average over just about every electrode on the head. Because
in auditory attention, you have this massive alpha lateralization thingies, right? Where it really shifts with the position of something in the. So, and I was just wondering, since there's about like judging something in the hemifield, and you mentioned neglect, then I would expect that if you would look at alpha asymmetry, you should, in the early blocks, you should already see that it's asymmetric, right?
Yes, you actually see that. So that's the prevailing theories behind the pseudo neglect, why it's there in the first place, because we seem to have this slight right hemispheric dominance also with respect to alpha power. And for some reason, then it seems to be fading away a little bit. I don't think we have that dedicated analysis about lateralization. I think the effect is rather weak, and this effect was striking enough. But yeah, it is in there. Okay. I think I'm just going to go on and bother you with the second part.
Sorry, I have a question, if I can ask.
Sorry.
Hi. Actually, two questions. One is if it is what you're observing, this difference in judgment about length of this line is you think these are the variability comes from perception or decision making. So it's this more at the perceptual level or at the decision making level, because if you think about decision making, you can think more like about criterion, decision criterion, and also like, I mean, now you show this trend which is linear. You talk about tiredness and about mind wandering. I think this could be more tiredness because it's linear and decreasing, while mind wandering it's going back and forth. So this would be better described, for example, by hidden Markov model and like showing that the task can be divided in different epochs where attention is more toward the task and epochs where the attention is more directed inward. And then, for example, you could say, okay, the criterion is different in these two different states. And I wanted to see if you try to epoch the session also in different states.
Not yet. So in answer to your first question, I don't know from this experiment, because we don't really have a way of, defining a decision criterion. We're just doing a study where we're looking at exactly that. So we'll be able to tell after, hopefully, where this has the most profound effect, whether that's something rather perceptual or something related to more on the confidence side. And what you said after, I completely agree. So mind wandering is probably something temporary, and that goes into the direction of what I'm going to talk about now. Other sources of variability, and not the more linear, potentially fatigue-related effect that was on those slides just now. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Good. So I have a cat on the slide. Yes, to get this talk going, and it's a participant or participation opportunity for you. Can you tell me what you see on this slide? So what?
What's in front of the cat?
Sorry?
What's in front of the cat?
I don't know. What do you think is in front of it? Yeah.
Something dark.
Something that it can hunt. Something that it can hunt.
That it can hunt, yeah. But do you notice anything about the cat?
The eyes.
The eyes, and what in particular? The pupils, exactly. And I think the most important thing, and this is maybe a little bit of a minor detail, we actually see the pupils change before something happens, right? So now they're getting really big, but the cat is still sitting, and you can already see the pupils widening. So something arousing must be happening in the vicinity of the cat, while it is still and is so in animal literature, this is always described as the quiescent state versus the locomotive state that happens now. So the cat moves towards whatever it sees. But the important thing is that even if it sits quietly, something arousing happens and it shows in the pupil. And that's not only true for cats, but also for us humans. And the reason for that is that we have these nice cores in our brainstem here. I always stumble over trying to pronounce them. So let's just call them LC and BF for the remainder of the talk. And those two cores, they're not the only ones, but they're the most pronounced influences here, if you wish. They release these two neurotransmitters actually across the whole cortex. And they're also supposed to somehow influence cortical activity. But more importantly, they have a direct line to what our pupil does, right? So if you look at the pupil at rest, if you put a participant into the MEG, for example, and you keep the constant, the lighting constant in there. No lightning in the MEG. Keep the lighting constant. Then you actually still see fluctuations of the pupil at rest. The pupil is sluggish, but it does fluctuate over time, right? And now the question is whether we can use this, because it is notoriously difficult for us to say something about these brainstem nuclei. Whether we can say something, whether we can use this correlation of pupil fluctuations at rest, and what they tell us about the influence of these two neurotransmitters on cortical neural population activity. So that was the rationale of the study that I'm going to tell you. Pupil size, what's the link with population activity? We can measure pupil size. We can measure using MEG what's going on in the brain. And hopefully that tells us something about how the activity in those two cores impinge on what's going on in cortex, okay? Now, allow me briefly to introduce the people in this project, because that was quite fun and it started quite early. So when we were still in Glasgow, it was actually Anna who recorded most of the data for this experiment, and I was just latching onto it because she recorded some resting state data with pupil activity attached. Then at some point we found out that these guys were doing exactly the same thing in Hamburg, and we teamed up. And then Joachim at some point moved to Münster, and he started working with Daniel Kluger, who also recorded some resting state MEG data together with pupil and other things. And in the end, that gave us a nice sample size that we could work with in order to look into the interplay between pupil changes and cortical activity. And here are already the first results that I want to show you. On the first couple of slides, I want to convince you that between the three labs, we are roughly seeing the same thing, okay? So we had recordings in Glasgow, in Hamburg, like I said, and in Münster. And the first thing that we did is just on the sensor level of the MEG, we checked in different frequency bands, what's the relationship with what the pupil is doing. And what this graph is supposed to tell you is that basically across all frequency bands, you see some relationship with what the pupil is doing, right? So across the board, there is a little bit of a pronounced, correlation, if you wish, with what's going on in the alpha and beta frequency bands. And that is true across all these different sites. But this could also just be a signal to noise ratio effect, because you all know that alpha beta oscillations are the ones that you see best in recordings of cortical activity. And yeah, just another plot to convince you that we're roughly looking at the same thing between the different sites and the different MEG systems that are used at these sites, okay? One more slide. So for now, you know that there is lots of correlations between band-limited cortical activity and pupil dilations going around. We wanted to look at what does this look like over time. I don't really want to bother you too much with these cross correlations. Again, here you can see that the shape is roughly similar between the three systems. And for our analysis, we then went on and pooled roughly similar cross correlations. You have to read them this way that in this case here, I think this is cortical activity leads pupil activity. So it's a bit difficult to capture what's going on here. But the way that you have to read it is that if something in the delta band happens, this is this dip here, that has an influence on what the pupil is doing roughly 1 second later, okay? The good thing is that we know that there's also roughly a lag of 1 second from what the LC is doing in our brainstem to what the pupil is doing. So actually the time axis, they're kind of like realigned in a way again, if we're really entertaining the possibility that what we're seeing in the pupil is due to what these brainstem cores are doing with their neurotransmitters, okay? And the other important thing here is that we see that between these this relatively low frequency range and the alpha frequency range and the gamma frequency range here, we see different profiles of when something happens in the brain in the different frequency bands against what the pupil is doing. So one take-home message here is that if we look into this activity, there are temporal specifics to what these different frequencies are doing. And the more important thing and the easier to explain part is if we look at it from a spatial perspective, right? So we were just interested in where do these different relationships occur in the brain. If we look at the different frequencies here in this plot and plot the brain from an anterior-posterior perspective, you can easily see here that in the low frequency ranges, we're looking at something that happens more anterior. In the alpha-beta frequency range, we have this positive correlation mostly that happens at posterior sites, and for gamma, something weaker happens that has something negative going on occipitally, and positive further to the front. If we condense this to the classical frequency ranges that we're used to looking at, you can see these pictures here. One interesting aspect, maybe we didn't really make much of it for the paper because we just don't know and it's a bit difficult. But the peak actually for the correlation with the delta frequency range or low theta, if you wish, is very close to the hippocampus. So it could be that we're looking here at episodes where some sort of like arousal mechanism triggers, I don't know, I'm not an expert, memory retrieval or memory encoding or something like that. That is purely speculative. Also interesting is if you look into the alpha frequency range where you see this nice dissociation between a positive correlation at occipital sites and a negative correlation here. And the take-home message from this slide is that you actually have very specific, cortically specific interactions between pupil-linked arousal and oscillatory activity, even within one particular frequency range. Good. So just to sum this up, this part, our sort of like starting point, if you go into the literature and look at what's out there, there was always this assumption that arousal has a relatively like global influence on what the brain is doing, cortical population activity. But looking at our results, they actually support that these influences are really different between different cortices and also between different frequencies, and they even differ in timing in terms of when these correlations occur. What I haven't shown you here is that we actually also found, so this was always about linear relationships. There's also a really interesting nonlinear inverted U-shaped relationship with alpha activity. Again, maybe something that points at differences between different alpha oscillators in the brain. And we also have had a look at slope excitability in the brain, which also seems to be strongly related with pupil-linked arousal. Of course, this is all very descriptive because we only have resting state data. And one of the next things that we want to do is now start looking at how these relationships change when we look at task behavior, for example. Okay. Don't really have that much time left, but I quickly wanted to show you the one sort of like epilogue bit, where we're now looking into whether, because if you embed everything in this context of physiological processes, have we looked at the sort of like the bottom rung in terms of what's going on in the body? And actually, Daniel in Münster and Joachim, they not only recorded MEG and pupil size, but also respiration. And the interesting link here is, if you look at the brainstem, that this complex here, which seems to be a little bit of a clock for our respiratory rhythm, also has links to the LC. So anatomically, it might make sense to check for correlations between what respiration is doing versus what the pupil is doing. And there are some papers out there about that already, but relatively obscure from the 80s and 90s. Of course, we get love for everything that was made in the 80s, but it's still worth looking into that. And there was a recent review that also motivated our analysis, where they actually looked at the whole literature and found only inconclusive evidence that there is a link between respiration and pupil size. And just 2 slides left to quickly talk about what we did is we looked at resting state recordings again. What's respiration doing? What you see nicely if you look at respiration, of course, this is a very, very cyclic process. So you get a really nice peak in your spectrum at about the breathing rate. And the interesting thing, maybe also something that is not widely known, as if you look at pupillometry, you actually also see a kind of like a resting rhythm of the pupil under constant lighting conditions, which is called the hippus. And that only emerges after a while. So the resting rhythm takes a little bit of time to get in the groove. What you see here, the different color shadings are different time sections. So the lighter color is the first 2 minutes of the recording, and the darkest color is the latest 2 minutes. So that is something that only develops over time. And the idea here is maybe that when we're in this resting state, that the pupil or the LC, the arousal, kind of latches on to what respiration is doing. Some evidence for that comes on this last slide, where we looked into the coupling of those 2 mechanisms, and actually you see a very nice coupling at that particular rate. The hippus, you've seen it on the previous slide, is also exactly in that frequency range. And here we see that these 2 seem to be getting along rather nicely. The gray line in this plot is like a test condition based on some permutation analysis that didn't give this locking bit. And you can also see that in this rose plots. But the major point that we can take home from this is that there seems to be some coupling going on. Again, descriptive and worth looking into in more data that we will hopefully collect in future experiments. Good. So just to conclude everything, the first part was on how potentially fluctuating cortical state on a time range that is a little bit longer than what we are usually looking at actually has an effect on sustained task performance. In that case, it was line bisection. Who knows what else we will find when we look at other behavioral effects. What also came out of this experiment is that we can divide our trends. This is the first slide, or the second slide that I showed you, that we have these trends over time, but also spontaneous things. I think there was a comment on that earlier, that the linear trends might be more fatigue related. And maybe if we talk about something like mind wandering, we have these episodes of several seconds where people are off task, but then find their way back into the task. And the last bit is that if we look at these episodes, maybe that has something to do with neuromodulatory influences. Okay, so it could be arousal related. And what I showed you about respiration, maybe we have to go even further than just the arousal fluctuations, but other physiological processes might also play a role in how a certain brain state develops at a certain point in time. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you for listening to me and for all of the interesting questions that I've already heard. And I hope that there is more coming soon from a lab. So like I said at the beginning, that is just a starting point, and we are now moving towards looking into that, also using mobile EEG situations where maybe we can have slightly more. You said it earlier about the more natural environment. I'm also interested in looking into what effect that has on these processes, and we want to compare lab-based experiments versus the real world. Yeah.
I think I need holidays after this day of
my voice at least.
Wow, thank you for the presentation. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, so maybe the chat makes up their mind and I'll ask the room. Timmer.
Yeah, really exciting work and presentation. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
So I have many questions, but that's one. So like in the pupil-linked arousal side, on one side you have these distributions of the link between pupil-related arousal, or pupil dilation, let's say, pupil dilation and alpha. So it was 11 hertz, something like that. And there you pointed us to the positive effects in the occipital regions and negative effects, like what could be somatosensory cortex. Now I wonder, so also like in a very difficult somatosensory task, wouldn't arousal increase? Wouldn't that also be reflected in pupil dilation? And how could it be that it's then negatively related out on the somatosensory?
That's a problem that we have, right? So we can't really tell what participants were doing when they were sitting in the MEG doing nothing. So everything that that we can say about this would be speculation. So why does it go down over time? Because
in other words, is there maybe like a general arousal effect and more region specific arousal effect, same for different alpha sources?
Okay.
Because I mean, you made the claim that there's that arousal is specific for each region, right? But this tells a different story, right? It says it upregulates occipital cortex, but if you also find pupil-linked arousal or upregulation of somatosensory cortex in other tasks, I just wondered, like, I just wondered whether your conclusion is that pupil-linked arousal is specific to visual regions. So it's maybe.
Okay. No. So my story is that we see a different effect in the cortices. That's why I said it's specific. But I think I know where you're coming from, and yeah, that's still an option. So it could be a global effect in the sense that it affects everything, but maybe in a different way. Yeah, so that's still a possibility, but the rest actually really rests on finding or looking at this in further experiments. I should also mention that, so I had this on one of the slides, on this one actually, that it was funny because when we published this, or shortly before, another paper came out that did exactly the same thing, and they even had task data. And you can look at that here, so essentially they find the same thing, and they find a variation of that in task data. And I think, if I remember correctly, even with different effects on different cortices. So yeah,
and depending on the task, they find different effects.
Yeah. But I'm not sure about the details. So yeah.
Questions in the chat? In the online internet?
There's something in the chat
system.
Pupil size.
That's
what Sonja said.
Can you go that deep with MEG? Sonja said?
Sonja said pupil size.
Pupil
exclamation
size.
mark.
Exclamation mark. Good question.
It's related to the cat.
That's a delayed response to the question that Christian asked about the cat.
And you were absolutely correct.
Little did I know.
Yeah. You might have seen this before, right, Sonja?
Don't prompt me.
Question, I mean, arousal, yeah. I looked at the cat, and it's good to have a cat in the slides. Why is the cat aroused? Is it just a passive slave and the body just decides to be aroused and then goes like, oh, that's arousing? Or does it have something in mind? Does it predict? I was thinking, you know, when you showed the 1 second lag, I was thinking of Peter Lakatosh and the delta band and the monkey eating sugar water. And then I was like, that there is some information in the cat's brain that kind of allows the cat to be certain, or like to some degree, that something will happen, yeah. And I was thinking about entropy, and I was thinking about can you model that somehow? That
and then your pupils.
Of course, I mean you should like. My question is, I think, I'm not sure what my question is, but I think it's what's the cognitive source of this? What's the cognitive source of that arousal, and how does that work? And is there work? Because I'm not familiar with the pupils at all. That kind of higher level cognitive variables, like say in speech, it would be, I don't know, contextual entropy or something like that. In the visual system, probably the same. That has direct access to the pupil a second before something is happening. I really don't know, but it's like, I mean, the cat it watches something, and then it goes like, I'm going to jump at it, but I need to prepare, and now I'm jumping. Right, and so that prediction internally generated then.
Yeah, so if we assume that the cat has some kind of like cognition, then I would still assume that this happened before you actually see something happening in the pupil.
Yeah,
some preparation.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
So it's like it's a, David would say it's an exhaust fumes of the cognitive process that you're looking at. So the eye goes up like after the well, not decision, but
yeah. So in what I've shown you in this descriptive thing, what we have assumed and what we have cited from the literature, those were always effects where we thought, okay, so the neurotransmitters do something to the brain, right? But I think there is some evidence also for the other route, the other ways, that you have a cognitive process that hinges on what is going on in the brainstem. Maybe, you know, poking those cores there to release something, to be more excited.
You need MRI for that, right? You can do it. You can see it with MEG, like when you want to study the lag, and you can't access the subcortical, the brainstem nuclei with MEG.
Yes. Just looking at pupil, that would be quite a stretch. To say something.
It's like universe of More questions?
There's one.
There's one in the chat.
You mentioned that your future plans are to meddle with mobile, e.g. how do you plan to circumvent the issues of external factors? Yeah, that is a huge problem. The only thing that we have so far is that we have this mobile eye tracker that does have a camera. So we can maybe roughly control for conditions of external lighting. Probably not lightning. Yeah. So that's going to be a tricky one. We're going to start out in the lab first with that to see how well that works in a more controlled environment.
And why mobile EEG? Are you interested on some social component? Like what would be the advantage to move to a mobile EEG experimental setup?
Very good. I think Sonia already answered the question. Yeah. So I think one of the reasons we're doing it is because we can. And yeah, I just got this really nice mobile EEG kit that I want to use. And the other reason is that we talked about it a little bit earlier, that it just makes sense to see how these processes that we maybe understand a little bit in the lab, these trends, these spontaneous fluctuations, how they play out in a more natural environment. And that could be somebody, you know, navigating a situation We do have in Stirling, we have somebody a while back who was doing an experiment with students finding books in the library. And he was nice enough also to record some pupil data. I think the actual study has already been published. And that is also going to give us a little bit of an idea of how difficult it is going to be to analyze this data, this sort of like mobile data. But generally, the idea is, you know, to be able to generalize a little bit more. And the ultimate goal always is to, you know, be able. I've talked about it a little bit more in the first part of the talk. Be able to predict, first of all, these episodes of lapsing attention, and maybe at some point even being able to intervene somehow. So maybe this is something for the next 5 years or so, to find a way, maybe by calling out somebody's name or whatever, to get them back into a state of, you know, focused attention on the task at hand. And that's probably something that you can study better in more natural situations.
Interesting, thank you. I think in principle, one could also study how these cycles of engagement and disengagement, they unfold during interaction, like during a dialogue or during an exchange between two persons. And it would be interesting how much the two persons are in sync in these cycles of stronger and engagement, stronger arousal, and less disengagement. Engagement.
That's a good avenue of research. Probably not mine, but yeah.
How many tries do you need? I mean, how low can you go with the stats? You know, I had 100 tries to fit for the first alpha data set that you showed and for the pupil data. I mean, I'm thinking about my car, you know, having an eye tracker in the windshield, and it looks at my pupil and says, Lars, you're tired, get a coffee.
Mm-hmm.
Which it does, but I think it does it based on the movement of the steering wheel. It has something in there.
Car manufacturers are much further than we are in research at the moment. So yeah, they have much more sophisticated mechanisms to tell you.
Yeah, they can't do magic either. Right? How many? Say you have a microelectrode or you have an eye tracker. Like, how many tries do you need to be sure that actually you're watching?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is the interesting question. How much can we reduce that time that we need to make reasonably good prediction? Yeah. So far, it requires a lot of time, but maybe we can find this one indicator or a combination of many that gives us a really good shot at saying, you shouldn't be driving just now.
Then you sell it to BMW.
Of course, yeah.
Become a rich person. Good plan.
That's it. Oh no.
Awesome. Okay, let's thank Christian again. Thank you guys online.